so much. I'm going to hit record. Brilliant. Thank you, Alan, for the reminder. Perfect. Let's start over. Today we are picking up our conversation on the way in which Judaism's encounter with modernity shaped its views on afterlife. And this is a very brief recap from last week. When I speak of Judaism's encounter with modernity, I refer to the Enlightenment and emancipation. The Enlightenment meaning the sweeping cultural and intellectual currents that ran across Western and Central Europe in the last decades of the 18th century. And by emancipation, I mean the attendant or the accompanying liberation of Jews from their ghettos in the places where the Napoleonic conquest took place. So France, Germany, and elsewhere in Western and Central Europe, Jews were, for the first time in centuries, actually in many places for the first time ever, invited to all of the privileges and rights of full citizenship under the law in many European nations. Those two trends, or those two phenomena, the emancipation of Jews from the ghettos and the sweeping intellectual and cultural upheaval that we refer to as the Enlightenment collectively, produce a radical remaking of Judaism and Jews starting in the last part of the 18th century and really taking off in the first couple of decades of the 19th century, with the first ever movement or denomination of Judaism coming into being with a combination of insight, drive, and money, underpinned by, I would say, some of the intellectual architecture of early reform. You have this really exciting period in Jewish history where you have intellects and Jews who are interested in becoming part of the German state in particular, in Germany and Austria. You have Jews who are insisting for the first time that they can be fully Jewish and also fully participatory in modern intellectual discourse, in the life of academia, and in other jobs and trades that heretofore had been restricted for Jews. And you have figures like Abraham Geiger, a young and brilliant rabbi, who basically provides the intellectual underpinnings of this movement, which we know as Reform, which effectively ground our Judaism in the same kind of historical critical study that was being applied in the German academies to every other historical study. In other words, in addition to a new interest in exploring ancient civilizations and literatures and history from a critical standpoint, even the Bible came under the same kind of historical critical scrutiny. And this was, I would say, at the heart of the Reform project. On the other side of the Reform project were certain liturgical reforms, in other words, reforming the practice within synagogues so that they would more closely resemble what was happening in Protestant churches. Remember, Germany was a highly Lutheran country. It is there that Luther's Reformation took place in the 1500s. So Germany was a Protestant country, which means that Christianity was centered around Bible study. So this also explains, I think, why the critical approach to the Hebrew or to the Bible became part of the early reformers' objectives. So you have all of these trends taking place, and one of the salient touch points for our line of inquiry is how all of these developments affected Judaism's relationship, or Jews' relationship, with the beliefs and texts that had been promulgated around the subject of what happens after we die. And in a nutshell, these reformers emphasized the immortality of the soul, believing that that idea was consonant with a pure reason, religion of reason, a religion that could be both spiritual, but even more would be entirely rational. This is also a key underlying point, grounding point for all Reform Judaism. The way I put it, I can't remember who first said this, but one of the guiding principles of my rabbinate, and I'm a very proud Reform rabbi, is that I should never have to teach a child something that he or she will later have to unlearn. So I'm very cautious about, for instance, even with a group of nursery school kids, when I take a Torah scroll out of the Ark, I tend not to say, this is the Torah that God gave to Moses at Mount Sinai. I might say, this is the Torah. It contains the most important stories, laws, and teachings about what it means to be a good Jewish person. That, to me, is a statement that can be backed up scientifically or rationally, whereas the former is the story that we tell about the Torah. And I try to differentiate the two. Not that it's necessarily something that can be processed intellectually by a 4-year-old, but over time, the things we say about our religion do accumulate in a way. And I think that we have a lot of adults running around who've never actually been invited into a safe conversation about the actual historical roots of our scriptural tradition until they are well into adulthood, if at all. And then it's very jarring to them as adults, and they feel that they were duped as children because they were told that somehow God sat around writing magical books all day. By the way, this makes me, if not a heretic, it does put me at one far end, even of the Reform rabbinate. We all learn this stuff in seminary, of course, but I've made a thoroughgoing commitment to incorporate the historical critical approach to text into my rabbinate. That's my way of honoring the legacy of Abraham Geiger, who's one of my personal intellectual heroes. Some chat. Am I recording? Yes. I am under the impression that don't teach what you need to unteach later might be Mordecai Kaplan. P.S. I work hard on this as well. Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, we're going to look at Mordecai Kaplan shortly, so let's move forward. So last week we got up to as far as 1869, and I'll just screen share to show you where we were. We were looking at, oh, come on, did I botch this yet again? Hang on. I need to find Acrobat Reader. Here we go. So this is the right program that I'm sharing with you, but it's the wrong document. Can everyone see a page on the screen that has my handwriting and it says Philadelphia Conference? Is that what's on your screen? Okay, good. I see some nodding heads. So Isaac Mayer Wise, the father of Reform Judaism in America, had a vision of coalescing all Jews and Judaism in the New World, in America at least, under a single banner of a new indigenous American Judaism. At the heart of that vision, by the way, was Wise's conviction that the way to do that project was to create the first ever academy for higher Jewish learning on American soil and start producing American rabbis. The Hebrew Union College opened its doors in 1875, and a handful of years later ordained its first class of rabbis, all young men in their early 20s. One might have even been at the tender age of 19. I was about as young as one can get these days to become a rabbi. I was ordained at the age of 26. I went to rabbinical school 2 weeks after graduating college, and I was young for my grade anyway. So I was ordained very young, 20 years ago actually, coming up on my 20th anniversary of ordination on June 2nd of this year. But at the time, you could be ordained because you didn't have to have a bachelor's degree from a college before going to Hebrew Union College. So this was Wise's vision. Let's produce an American rabbinate. And because up until this point, of course, every rabbi in America had been an immigrant, at least of the Ashkenazi rabbinate. There may have been some Sephardic Orthodox rabbis who were being privately ordained, but in terms of an institutional Judaism, this was Wise's vision. But before long, he was, I think, outpaced by his more radical compatriot and contemporary, Rabbi David Einhorn. David Einhorn composed a prayer book called Olat Tamid. I actually found a digital copy online. If I have a few moments, I'll try and show it to you. It's really amazing. Olat Tamid becomes the template for a book called the Union Prayer Book, a very small volume that some of you had acknowledged you grew up with. And that actually is the antecedent for a book that the Reform movement produced in the mid-70s called Gates of Prayer. Gates of Prayer is the antecedent for the current Reform movement prayer book that we use at WRT called Mishkan Tefillah. And the prayer book that Wise had created called Minhag America, which was actually much less radical in its reforms to the liturgy, kind of fell into obsolescence. David Einhorn's son-in-law, Kaufmann Kohler, becomes Isaac Mayer Wise's successor as the second president of the Hebrew Union College. By the way, HUC is only one of 3 core institutions that Wise builds from whole cloth to create the architecture, the infrastructure of the Reform movement. After Hebrew Union College was actually the second. The first thing he did was convene a kind of federation of like-minded synagogues from across America. That became the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. The main purpose of convening those congregations was to fund the Hebrew Union College, to create the seminary. So you have a union of synagogues that today is the Union for Reform Judaism. They helped to establish the Hebrew Union College. The Hebrew Union College produces rabbis that coalesce into a body known as the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis. I'm a proud member of all 3 of these institutions. I am a graduate of the Hebrew Union College. I am a member of the Central Conference of American Rabbis because I'm a dues-paying Reform rabbi. And WRT is proudly one of the 900 synagogues in the Reform movement and a member of the URJ, whose president, Rabbi Rick Jacobs, is familiar to all of you because he is also the Rabbi Emeritus of WRT, having served our congregation from 1991 to 2011 as the senior rabbi. So we looked last week at one of the principles outlined in the Philadelphia Conference. This was a group of rabbis convened by Wise, but whose principal voices were David Einhorn and Kaufmann Kohler, who were more radical in their vision of how far we should go to reform Judaism. And they included this statement: the belief in the bodily resurrection has no religious foundation, and the doctrine of immortality refers to the after existence of the soul only. So this is kind of where all of the Enlightenment thinking arrives on the subject that we've come to study, on the subject of what happens after we die. Reform Judaism explicitly now rejects everything pertaining to the afterlife except for this idea of the immortality of the soul. The Pittsburgh Platform, composed 16 years later upon another convening of the UAHC, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, and the CCAR, the Reform Rabbinate, further takes this point in the same direction and writes, we assert the doctrine of Judaism. Notice that they don't say our version of Judaism or our stream or our denomination or Reform Judaism. They say Judaism. These are all Reform rabbis, but they thought of themselves as the voice of the American rabbinate. We assert the doctrine of Judaism, that the soul of man is immortal, grounding the belief on the divine nature of the human spirit, which forever finds bliss in righteousness and misery in wickedness. We reject, as ideas not rooted in Judaism, the belief both in bodily resurrection and in Gehenna and Eden, or hell and paradise, as abodes for everlasting punishment or reward. By the way, couple of thoughts here, starting with the second half of this statement. We reject as ideas not rooted in Judaism, right, this business, the belief both in bodily resurrection and in Gehenna and Eden. We haven't talked about Gehenna yet, we will today, as abodes for everlasting punishment or reward. So in other words, this is really important to see early, I shouldn't say early, but the start of what we call today classical Reform Judaism explicitly rejects the ideas of bodily resurrection or the ideas of heaven and hell. They reject that clearly because they understand that some Jews continue to hold on to these beliefs. And they further want to say, these are not rooted, these are not Jewish. I have basically endeavored over the course of our study to disprove that claim and to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that no, in fact, the resurrection of the body and other ideas like Gehenna are in fact indigenous to Judaism, or if they're not indigenous, they come by way of ancient Greek philosophy and are as much as 2,000 years old, or almost 1,900 years old at the time of the writing of this document, and therefore this is not an accurate claim. Moreover, they say we ground the belief in the soul of man being immortal on the divine nature of the human spirit, which forever finds bliss in righteousness and misery in wickedness. In other words, a beautiful poetic way of saying, we don't believe in heaven and hell. We believe that if you are a good person, that is its own reward in this life, not in the world to come, not in Olam Haba, right here and now. And if you are bad, if you are wicked, that is its own punishment. So spiritual reward, spiritual punishment, all happen in the here and now, not in the hereafter. That's what's contained in article number 7 of the Pittsburgh Platform. And further reinforcing this, much later, Kaufman Kohler, who was a young upstart of a rabbi at the time of the writing of the Pittsburgh Platform, by this point a much older rabbi, he lived to be well into his 90s, I believe, writes an essay in a book, or writes a book called Jewish Theology, Systematically and Historically Considered. All of the heads of the Hebrew Union College until last year, as a matter of fact, have, well, no, not even, including President Andrew Rayfeld, PhD, who is the successor to our beloved Rabbi Dr. Aaron Pankin, PhD, of blessed memory, have all been very serious academics as well as rabbis. The only exception was the rabbi who ordained me, who was no slouch in the academic department, but who didn't have a PhD, Rabbi Sheldon Zimmerman. Shelley Zimmerman came to the presidency of HUC having served most of his career as a congregational rabbi. But for most of its history, HUC's presidents have been rabbis who are also PhD academics. Kaufman Kohler writes, "He who recognizes the unchangeable will of an all-wise, all-ruling God in the immutable laws of nature must find it impossible to praise God according to their traditional formula as the, quote, reviver of the dead, but will avail himself instead of the expression used in the Union Prayer Book after the pattern of Einhorn." And remember, Einhorn is Kaufman Kohler's father-in-law. Quote, "He who has implanted within us immortal life." That language, by the way, is from the blessing after the reading of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher nata lanu Torat emet, v'chayei olam nata betochenu. Literally, we praise you, eternal God, asher nata lanu Torat emet, who has given to us, natan lanu Torat emet, who has given to us a Torah of truth, v'chayei olam nata betochenu, and who has implanted within us eternal life, or immortal life. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah, blessed are you, giver of the Torah. So again, a full replacement of any idea of resurrection of the dead with the belief that the reformers could get behind, which was the immortality of the soul. I'm going to pause here for any questions or comments. I'm looking in the chat window first. Was the first ordination the Treifa banquet? So yes, in 1883, Hebrew Union College at Wise's planning hosted a banquet in honor of the first ordinee class of the Hebrew Union College, and created an elaborate menu and invited dignitaries from all over the Jewish communities of America. And if you look at the menu, you'll see that every course has treif in it. No pork, but tons of shellfish and frog's legs. And it caused an uproar. There's a lot of mythology and urban legend associated with the Treifa banquet, particularly around what exactly or how exactly it happened. No one really knows. Was Isaac Mayer Wise giving a middle finger to his more conservative-minded rabbis in the UHC? I believe not. I happen to subscribe to the theory expounded by Rabbi Dr. Lance Sussman, who believes that the planning of the Treifa banquet was left to the president of Isaac Mayer Wise's own temple, what today is called the I Am Wise Temple, or the Plum Street Temple in downtown Cincinnati, or KK B'nai Yeshurun, who was apparently much more radical in his vision of Judaism than Wise himself was, and who also had the money. And Wise, like most rabbis, didn't want to get involved in the catering. Like if I were asked by my temple president, what can be my job? I would say, well, if you're willing to put up the money, you can choose everything else. And either Wise did not want to, did not have the stomach to argue with his temple president. That may be because Wise had a history of getting in arguments with his temple presidents. When he was a young rabbi in Albany in the 1850s, he got into a fist fight with his temple president on the day of Rosh Hashanah. He had been fired by the board one day before Rosh Hashanah, but Wise showed up for services anyway. And the newspaper reports that a fist fight broke out on the Bima when Wise went to take the Torah out of the ark, and his temple president physically tried to stop him, and they had to call in the town constable to break up the fight. These are all like, if you thought that being a rabbi was just a mild-mannered profession, look to Isaac Mayer Wise and think again. In any case, so maybe he just didn't want to get into another fight with his temple president. Whatever the reason, you do have this kind of flashpoint in Reform Jewish American history of a banquet that caused an uproar. The legend is that a bunch of rabbis stormed out in protest and immediately went to New York to establish the Jewish Theological Seminary, the conservative movement's rabbinical training ground. That is not true. The conservative movement was already established in America at the time. I have a bunch of Union prayer books that were my parents'. That's a comment. I am not surprised. They're small and easy to store. What does the divine nature of the human spirit actually mean? That we are created in God's image? Yeah, not clear. Probably something like that. I guess it's important to understand that the Reform rabbis in America, even the most radical, are not atheists. Their vision of religion is deeply monotheistic and centered around God. They are influenced by rationalist Enlightenment religious philosophers like Immanuel Kant, and in particular Hermann Cohen, who was a Kantian in his outlook. Basically, they are proponents of what they would have called a pure religion of reason or ethical monotheism. And I mentioned this last week. This is really the genesis of a time where people start talking about a Judeo-Christian tradition, as if the two have more in common than they do that is different. I'm not sure I support that belief, that Judaism and Christianity have more in common than they do different. But in America from the 19th and 20th centuries to the present day, in the 21st century, I would say that opinion has held sway. That in fact, you can speak of a Judeo-Christian tradition because our traditions are above all ethical monotheistic traditions. The idea that religion is mostly about doing the right thing and being a good person, and the way in which we do that is we all believe in one God who has given us laws to follow. That's sort of the classical distillation of ethical monotheism. Somebody says there's a participant who can't get in. A bunch of admit people. Sorry. It's hard to see the participant window when I'm doing a share screen, so Apologies if you're just joining us. Judy Gross, I've unmuted you and your hand is raised so you can speak. Judy or Ivan.
Yeah, hi. You mentioned the seepage of Hellenistic culture, a certain part, into the Bible today. I have two questions. Could you tell us what other very important part of Hellenistic culture formed the body of what we know today about Judaism or the Bible? And my second question is, what about influences from equally ancient cultures, say, Egyptian, and for the matter of fact, Roman, which of course itself is heavily influenced or copied the Hellenistic culture, gods, and so forth?
Excellent. I love this question. I don't want to digress too far, but I'll try and outline just a few thoughts. The question, look, no religion exists, grows up, is formed, developed, evolves in a vacuum. All religions are smaller functions of larger forces that affect civilizations. And inasmuch as all human civilizations at some point or points end up in conversation with other civilizations. Conversation would be a gentle word. It's more often collision.
Yeah.
You have, I believe, the ability to look at Judaism specifically, or the civilization of the Jewish people, as giving evidence at various points in our history of the ways in which we have been deeply influenced by our conversation with or collision with other civilizations, religious civilizations in particular. And this goes back all the way to the beginning, right? There's no such thing as just Jews who just magically pop up as Jews. Whether or not we were in fact a religion of breakaway slaves from Pharaonic Egypt, which has very little extra textual or archaeological support behind it, but that's the myth, that's the master story with a capital M that we tell, that we were a band of slaves that retained an earlier covenantal identity with the God of the Hebrews, the patriarchs and matriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, their ancestral faith with Yahweh. All of that is, I wouldn't say specious, but it's speculative. Or perhaps we are an evolution of earlier Canaanite religion, whose master story later incorporated a kind of anti-Egyptian polemic into it, right? So most of the Exodus story is an anti-Egyptian polemic. They have many gods, we have one God. They worship death, we worship life. They believe in human slavery, we believe in freedom. I'm not saying that those things are true, I'm saying that those are formative themes that can be drawn out of our sacred literature. It is hard to know how much of an influence ancient Egyptian civilization had on Judaism. Having been to Egypt in recent months, just in February, I was struck by how very, very different ancient Egyptian civilization looks and feels from ancient Israelite civilization. That combined with my awareness that there is no archaeological record, nor is there much any extra-textual evidence that suggests that there were ever massive numbers of Jews living in ancient Egypt with their own Israelite identity, suggests to me that that's probably in the story more than in history. Whereas there's all manner of evidence, not just in our own Bible, but in extra-textual sources, meaning sources other than our own Bible, and archaeology that suggests that ancient Israelite religion was heavily indebted to Canaanite practices. Even something like a golden calf. I mean, the central icon of the Canaanite cult was a bull or a calf. So there's lots and lots and lots of evidence that suggests that Judaism or ancient Israelite religion was highly syncretic, meaning convergent with or took on properties of ancient Canaanite religion. As for the Hellenistic influence, you have Greek philosophy, wisdom literature, religious beliefs percolating into mainstream Israelite texts and traditions many centuries before the Common Era. And books like the book of Proverbs in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Job especially, the book of Ecclesiastes, all are believed to have been heavily influenced by Greek wisdom literature. And then, of course, so much so that by the time of the Maccabees, you have a full-on Hellenistic program of Jews who were being assimilated into the larger Greek civilization, which had dominated all of the Mediterranean world, including the Levant, the part of the Mediterranean coast that includes Lebanon, or parts of Turkey, Lebanon, Israel, and the Sinai into Egypt. So, the Alexandrian conquest in 333 BCE was, in many ways, total in the way in which the province of Judea fell under the grip of larger Hellenistic civilizational forces. And the same goes for the Romans. I mean, I would say that Rabbinic Judaism is more a rejection of Roman norms, but just because that's what's in our text doesn't mean that's how the people were living. And there's a lot of evidence from cities like Tzipori or Sepphoris in central northern Israel that Jews, pagan Romans, and early Christians were all living side by side. And that suggests to me that they had more in common, at least in their way of life, if not their personal beliefs and practices, than they had that was different among them. And on and on and on. Every place where Jews have lived, whether under Roman rule or under Spanish Christian rule or Spanish Muslim rule, we have adapted to the larger norms of those civilizations and incorporated them into our own practice. I mean, I might have mentioned this. Maimonides wrote in a dialect of Arabic when he wrote his Guide to the Perplexed. Jewish poets were writing in Arabic in the Golden Age of Spain because that was the lingua franca. And even today, I would argue that we are, of course, all Jews, or friends of Jews on this Zoom call this morning, but that much of our primary identity, even as Jews, is shaped by the American experience. Now, Ivan, you're an immigrant, so you have as much been shaped by your neolog European, Romanian identity as you have by your decades in America. But nevertheless, I think on the whole, my point applies to all the members of our class this morning. So as we look at this just very briefly, and then we're going to kind of do a pivot. If you look at the same document that I had up before and just scroll down a little bit more, you can see that in 1990, the conservative movement authored its own statement of principles. It's a long document. As you can see up here, I wrote, this is from pages 28 to 32. So it's actually a fairly substantial booklet. Whereas the Reform movement tried to get everything out on paper in one page, do a one-pager, 10 principles in 1885. By 1990, the conservative movement has like a 50-page book. And one of its last segments is on eschatology. You may recall that I introduced us to this word early in our study when we talked about Daniel. Daniel is an eschatological book, again, not scatological, eschatology, eschatology, meaning that which is concerned with what happens at the end of days, or the future, but not like next week. This is the apocalyptic future. I'll just read a few lines. The impulse is to create and actualize visions of an idealized, quote, age to come, we know the Hebrew for that is olam haba, is thoroughly rooted in individual human beings and in communities of which they are a part. For the individual, it expresses itself in the conviction that a human life, as brief and transient as it may seem to be, nevertheless has lasting significance, that death does not mark the absolute end of a person's identity, that our lives have an, quote, afterward. And it goes on from there. These visions of the future, I'm looking at this paragraph, when articulated as a religious philosophical doctrine, have come to be known as eschatology, from the Greek eschaton, or last things, and logos, or discourse or thought, or word. This goal the prophet called acharit hayamim, the days to come, Isaiah 2, verse 2. The rabbis used several terms, olam haba, the age, not world to come. See how that's consonant with what I've taught you. Atid lavo, meaning the destined future, and Yemot HaMashiach, the days of the Messiah, the anointed one, who is designated to usher in the redemptive era. So unlike Reform Judaism in the 100 years earlier, conservative Judaism of 1990 acknowledges that all of these ideas have a place, an authentic place within Judaism. What do conservative Jews, quote unquote, believe? Well, that's a much harder single theme to pull out of this essay. There are a number of different points around this. Sorry, the margins got a little bit cut off, but a couple lines. Thus, if Judaism's age to come is an age of universal peace and social justice, that is what the classical reformers taught, it is because our Torah commands that we strive to create that kind of social order in the here and now, and because our prophets railed against our ancestors' failure to do so in their own day. To refer to these doctrines as metaphors in no way diminishes their significance, their value, or their impact on our lives. No human being can live without a dream. As conservative Jews, then, we affirm the substance of classical Jewish eschatological thinking. Its central thrust is that in partnership with God, we can create an ever more perfect social order, not inevitably, not steadily, and perhaps not in our lifetimes, but eventually, with the proviso that we strive to the extent of our ability to help bring it about. So they're basically saying, look, even if you take it as a metaphor, there is a place within our conservative Judaism for eschatological thinking, though the preferred mode for thinking about it is how will we, as God's partners, bring about that universal age of peace and redemption that our prophets articulated and that our people have always dreamed about. So that's sort of the conservative road through what happens after we die. As of 1990, and I would say that it is still consonant with what, and it goes on from there, consonant with what conservative Jews believe today, though again, what do conservative Jews believe is no more meaningful a question than what do Reform Jews believe. There's a very wide berth, B-E-R-T-H, a platform for both of our movements, for each of our movements, has to be wide enough to accommodate great degrees of variance in actual personal individual belief. And that's why it really is okay to be a Reform-affiliated Jew who has a more literal belief in an afterlife, or to be a Reform-affiliated Jew who has no belief in an afterlife. They're both to be accommodated within Reform, and the same is true for conservative too. I believe that Reform and conservative Judaism are really just slightly different shades of the same basic color family, but that's a story for a different time. This is, again, I've said several times, if you want to know what Jewish people really are thinking and believing, look to their prayer books. And this is the prayer book published in 1994 by the Reconstructionist movement, which I think is a really good way into what Reconstructionists articulate around these issues of what happens after we die. This is Atagi Bor Leolam Adonai. You notice what's missing here. It goes straight to Rab Lehoshia. They skipped a phrase. It should be Atagi Bor Leolam Adonai, Mechaye Metim Ata, Rab Lehoshia, Mechaye Metim Ata. Or we say in Reform practice, Atagi Bor Leolam Adonai, that's in the prayer. Mechaye Hakol Ata, Rab Lehoshia. So what is Mechaye Metim Ata or Mechaye Hakol Ata? Mechaye Metim Ata means you resurrect the dead. Very plain and simple translation. Mechaye Hakol Ata means you give life to all. The Reconstructionist movement didn't take the Reform adaptation of the phrase Mechaye Hakol Ata, you give life to all. They just cut the whole thing. Atagi Bor Leolam Adonai, Rab Lehoshia. Doesn't work so well melodically, but then again, I have submitted before you before that this melody is a little too jaunty for its subject matter, right? Mechalkel chayim bechet. You give life to everything and you resurrect the dead. I mean, it's really not very, it's not a very, it's not a tune that conveys the gravitas of the prayer. Here's the translation. You are forever powerful, Almighty One, abundant in your saving acts. That's Rab Lehoshia. In summer, we say Morid Hatal, you send down the dew. In summer and spring, in winter and fall, we say you cause wind to blow and rain to fall. Mashiv haruach umorid hagashem. In loyalty you sustain the living, nurturing the life of every living thing, upholding those who fall, healing the sick, freeing the captive. This is all word for word. And remaining faithful to all life, held dormant in the earth. I think that the Reformed translation, going all the way back to David Einhorn, Ola Tamid, is, thou keepest faith with those who sleepest in the dust. Or in modern English, you keep faith with those who sleep in the dust. I used to think when I was a kid that that was like homeless people. People who were just like, unfortunately, sleeping in the dust because they didn't have a roof over their heads. I later learned that that is a metaphor for dead people. Those who sleep in the dust, they're not really sleeping, and the dust means 6 feet underground. Here it says, Lishenei afar, they kept the phrase, those who sleep in the dust, over here, and they said, held dormant in the earth. Now, why would they make that translator's change? I believe in order to help us understand that this prayer can be taken as a metaphor, right? When we say that God gives life to that which sleeps in the dust, it could mean a dead person. It could also mean a seed. A seed is dormant in the earth until its life-giving capacity begins to blossom forth and it becomes, once again, an observably living thing. And then finally, who can compare to you? Mi chamocha ba'al givurot umidomelach. Who can resemble you? The source of life and death. Who makes salvation grow? Umatzmiach Yeshua. And then the last line, v'ne'emanata lahachayot kol chai. We say hakol. Conservative and Orthodox Jews say hametim. You are faithful to give life, or faithful are you in giving life to every living thing. Blessed are you, the fount of life, who gives and renews life. Does not say resurrects the dead. So the Reconstructionist movement also, indebted to the rational reforms of the Reform movement, adopts similar but not identical language in its prayer. And I will stop the screen share and invite hands, questions, thoughts, and comments at this juncture, should you wish to raise a hand. Or you can just unmute yourself if you'd like to chime in. In which case I've been abundantly clear. Great. So here's what I'd like to do. We have a couple of thoughts that we haven't touched on. And I've kind of tantalizingly alluded to interesting notions like Gehenna that we haven't given much time to explore. And we're going to do that now. And then I'll have this will be like a Lord of the Rings movie. There will be 3 different endings to today's class. But I think they'll all be meaningful. And this is sort of like an odds and ends. But I think you can see from the last several texts, Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist, the ways in which the theme of resurrection has been kind of muted in Jewish tradition. The immortality of the soul has been highlighted. For Orthodox Jews, I've got to hand it to Orthodoxy. I think by not changing the liturgy, the Orthodox Jews have made it possible for Reform and other Jews to revisit the traditional liturgy and maybe re-invite into our awareness of our prayer language our capacity for metaphor. When I pray, and I gave a sermon on this on Yizkor a few years ago, announcing that I was totally comfortable praying Mechayeh HaMetim, even though I do not literally believe in the resurrection of the dead. I do believe in the metaphorical capacity for that which is dead or appears to be dead or dormant to come back to life. And I believe that that is a powerful metaphor. It certainly is an operative metaphor for all agriculture, as I have said. And it is certainly, there's a beautiful Jewish custom that says you should say, Baruch atah Adonai mechayeh hametim, when you greet a person you have not seen in person for a year or more. I would like to invite us, before I change subjects, to consider that Baruch atah Adonai mechayeh hametim might be exactly the right bracha, the right blessing that we want to say when we are able to greet and hug and embrace one another in person after the worst of this pandemic subsides and it is safe to go back out and see people you haven't seen in a while. I think that would really be a meaningful way of breathing new life into an old prayer with which Reformed Jews understandably have a conflicted relationship. I really love the idea that when I see my family in the flesh the next time, we might say a Michaye Hametim blessing as if God has brought the dead back to life. I think there's something quite beautiful and powerful in putting it that way. And for me also, it resurrects a prayer that for many Reformed Jews has been, if not dead, then dormant. So just a little bit of a kind of like a teaser or an invitation for you to rethink your own relationship with this traditional prayer. Somebody said that my audio dropped out. That is a shame. Can you hear me now? Thumbs up if you can hear me. Do an actual thumbs up. Okay. For the benefit of those who could not hear me, and I'm sorry, I really think this is on Zoom's end, I said, I believe that it would be meaningful for us when we can greet one another in person to say the blessing, Baruch Atah Adonai, Mechaye Hametim, blessed are you, eternal God, who resurrects the dead, or who brings the dead back to life. It is a Jewish custom to say that prayer when you see someone you haven't seen in a very long time. I don't believe in the literal resurrection of the dead, but I'd like us all to have an opportunity to revisit our own relationship with a prayer that has been kind of, I think, unfairly marginalized in the Reformed Jewish prayer book and tradition. That's all. And now for something completely different. So I have here a document on the screen that says Judaism on the Afterlife, Ghosts, Gehenna, Golems, and more. And we're going to just do a little bit of a walk through some Jewish traditions that pertain to what happens after we die, that definitely are more on the margins of Judaism. But let's take a look. I think that my screen ought to be set up for you to read this. I might just enlarge the typeface a little bit. There we go. From the Hebrew Bible, 1 Samuel chapter 28. And because this is the first biblical text we're looking at today, we shall say together, Baruch Atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for giving us this opportunity to immerse ourselves in words of our sacred texts. The prophet Samuel. Samuel is the one who anointed both King Saul and King David as king. So Samuel was dead, and all of Israel lamented him. They buried him in Ramah in his city. That's where he's from. Meanwhile, Saul, who had become king under Samuel's authority, had outlawed ghosts and familiar spirits throughout the land. He didn't actually outlaw the ghosts. He outlawed the practice of consulting ghosts. That is important. One, it's consistent with lines in both the books of Leviticus and the book of Deuteronomy, which prohibit seances. They prohibit consulting ghosts. Hang on, I have a chat up. I want to make sure. Yes, I will send this document around through Natalie. Thank you for the request. So you're not allowed to have a seance. And I believe generally when the Bible legislates against something or mentions that something was an outlawed practice, that's a good indication that it was actually being done. The Philistines, who are the enemies of the Israelites at this time, mustered and approached, camping at Shunem. Saul mustered all Israel and camped at Gilboa, so you have these opposite camps preparing for battle. Saul spotted the Philistine camp and was afraid. His heart trembled terribly. So Saul inquired of the Eternal, but God did not answer him. Not in dreams, nor by Urim. Urim and Tumim are oracular devices described by the Bible, by the Torah itself, that the high priest would wear. We don't know whether it was like little dice that you could roll or like that magic 8-ball toy. Am I going to win $1 million? Future looks hazy. So some kind of oracular device held or worn by the priests, nor through the prophets. In other words, Saul tried everything he could to figure out whether or not he was going to prevail in this battle to come against the fearsome Philistines or would fall. And nobody's able to give him a clear answer. Saul said to his courtiers, "Seek out a woman for me who is a mistress of ghosts, so that I can consult her and inquire through her." So he goes to his advisors and says, I need an oracle. Or specifically, I need a woman who can conduct a seance. Fascinating that such a figure is taken for granted as a, part of ancient Israelite society. Like the king knows that there must be these people, but they're living in the shadows. So he tasks his attendants with finding one. Saul disguised himself. Why did he do that? Well, remember, he's outlawed seances. He's outlawed the practice that he is now about to invite. So he put on different clothes. He and 2 men with him went until they reached a woman at night. And he said to the woman, "Please cast a spell for me concerning a ghost. Bring up for me the one whom I direct you." So Saul, disguised as an ordinary guy, tells this woman, who becomes known in the tradition as the Witch of Endor. That's where this takes place, in the village of Endor, and she is generally known in literature as the Witch of Endor. The woman said to him, "Look, you know what Saul has done, that he has banned ghosts and familiar spirits in the land. Why are you entrapping me in order to have me put to death?" In other words, she says, "This is a trick. I know, I can tell that whoever you are, you're in league with the king and you're doing this to get me hauled up, before the king's court." So Saul swore to her by the Eternal, saying, "As God lives, you won't get in trouble over this." This is my own translation, but I'm trying to capture the idiomatic sense of things. The woman replied, "So, whom shall I call up for you?" And he said, "Call up Samuel for me." A chat window asked me if this is where Shakespeare got the witches from Macbeth. Probably not, though Shakespeare knew his Bible as well as much other literature. So who knows, witches have been in all literatures across all civilizations. And what's interesting is if you thought they weren't in ours, you thought wrong. Okay, so Saul says, "I want to speak to the prophet Samuel." The woman recognized Samuel, and I wrote seek, meaning, is that a typo? Yes, it's possible that it wouldn't be a typo, it would be a scribo, right? Is it possible that that is a scribal error in the biblical text itself? Because clearly what is meant is she recognized Saul. She recognized the king Saul and shrieked loudly. The woman said to Saul, "Why have you tricked me? You are Saul." So she knew immediately. She was onto him. This is no ordinary guy dressed in disguise. Or no ordinary guy. It's the king in disguise. The king assured her, "Do not be afraid. But what do you see?" And the woman said to Saul, "I see a God rising up from the earth." The word is, I believe, Elohim in Hebrew. Fascinating. So a divine being, an apparition, something supernatural. Saul said to her, "What is his appearance?" And she replied, that should be "an old man arises. He is wrapped in a robe." Saul knew that it was Samuel. He bowed low in homage, his face to the ground. Remember, this dead prophet whom he is calling up is the one who anointed Saul king. We also know that Saul is beginning to be plagued by mental illness. Saul goes batty and spends most of his life, the rest of his life, both persecuted and persecuting his anointed successor, King David. Then Samuel, the risen prophet from the ground, said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" And Saul said, "I'm in terrible distress. The Philistines are waging war against me, and God has departed my presence and answers me no more, not by the hand of the prophets nor in dreams. I called upon you to tell me what I should do." Samuel said, "Why are you asking me, given that God has departed your presence and become your enemy?" In other words, I can't help you, buddy. I'm God's prophet. And if God doesn't want to speak to you, why should you think that I would be any different? Saul responds, "The Eternal has done to you exactly..." No, this is Samuel continuing. "The Eternal has done to you exactly as God foretold me. The Eternal has ripped the kingship out of your hand and given it to your fellow, to David, because you did not heed the voice of the Eternal and did not carry out God's wrath against Amalek, the other enemy nation. That is why God has done thusly to you today. Furthermore," bad news, more bad news, "the Eternal will deliver up Israel along with you into the hand of the Philistines. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me," meaning 6 feet underground. "Likewise, the Eternal will deliver the Israelite encampment into the hands of the Philistines." Bad news. Saul immediately collapsed on the ground, unable to get up. He was deeply frightened by Samuel's words. His strength utterly failed him, for he had eaten no meal that entire day and night. I love what happens next. The woman approached Saul and observed how upset he was and said to him, "Your handmaid listened to you," meaning I placed my life in your hands and heeded your instruction that you communicated to me. In other words, I held this seance. Now you listen to the voice of your handmaid. I will put a slice of bread before you. Eat and regain your strength before setting out on your way. See, even witches in the Bible are good Jewish mothers. What she is mostly concerned about is, did the king have lunch? But Saul refused, saying, I cannot. But when that should be his courtiers, and the woman needled him, no, eat, you have to eat. He took their advice and then rose from the ground and sat on the bed. The woman had a stall-fed calf in the house. She quickly slaughtered it, took flour and kneaded it, and baked some matzot. She set this before Saul and his courtiers. They ate and then rose and left the same night. And that is, in fact, what happens. The prophecy does come true, and the Philistines defeat the Israelites in battle, and Saul elects to have his own sword attendant run him through and take his own life once he's been gravely wounded. So an unhappy ending for King Saul, one prophesied by the witch of Endor through the calling up of the ghost of the prophet Samuel. So just a little bit on how ancient Israelite religion nevertheless, despite its paucity of comment on the subject of what happens after we die, you get that there are little bits and pieces of legend that make their way into Israelite consciousness, that the death that we meet at the end of our human days on earth may not be the end, that there may be some kind of spiritual existence, at least for some people, but you need an important mediator like a witch to call you up. And also there's this notion that these are all occult practices, right? These are dangerous, these are restricted, but they are known. The Bible knows of these practices and knows that they are dangerous and therefore legislates against them. So there's this cloud of secrecy and illegality to what Saul is asking the witch to do for him. And the prophet himself, the ghost of Samuel, is really pissed off. He's like, what are you bothering me for? I'm dead. Like, leave me alone. Okay. We'll just look at a little bit more on the subjects of the occult and the afterlife in Judaism. So really interesting. There is a place that many of you who have visited Israel have walked through, and maybe don't even know that you walked through it, called Gei Ben Hinnom. I've written it here in Hebrew. Gei Ben or Gei Ben Hinnom. Literally, a gay or a guy in Hebrew is a valley. Ben Hinnom means the children of Hinnom or the Hinnomites, the valley of Ben Hinnom. Gei Ben Hinnom is elided in its pronunciation to become Gehinnom, and from there becomes Gehenna. On a map, it's here. Can you see this map? No map is showing, right? Zoom is not great with that, so let me show you the map here. Now you can see the map. You can see right here is in the center the grave of Oskar Schindler, interestingly. And you see right here where the red dot is, Gei Ben Hinnom Street. Well, where are we? Let's take a look. Here's King David's tomb. Here is the Zion Gate of the old city of Jerusalem. Now I'm going to just zoom out a little bit. And here, where my cursor is traveling, are the walls of the old city of Jerusalem, right? Here's the Western Wall. Here's the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Here's the Temple Mount where the Dome of the Rock is. Here's the Mount of Olives and the Garden of Gethsemane. So way down here on this side, right here is the Mamilla Mall, the pedestrian mall, and right here is the King David Hotel. So just a 15-minute, not even, 10-minute walk from the King David Hotel. 10 minutes, if you're walking briskly, to Gei Ben Hinnom Street. This valley on this side, and this part of Jerusalem right here, is where David's original settlement was. So just so you see, This southern part of Jerusalem is identified as Ge Ben Hinnom, the valley of Ben Hinnom, or Gehinnom, which later becomes Gehenna. But why? Why would that be the case? Well, you need to know a little bit about what used to happen in that valley. So we shall read briefly. From Joshua 15:8, by the way, just so you know, this valley is well attested in the biblical literature, going all the way back to Joshua, the 6th book of the Bible. Then the boundary, they're talking about the boundary of Jerusalem when the Israelites conquered the land in the time of Joshua, after Moses died and the Israelites went in as shock troops to defeat the Canaanites. Then the boundary ascended into the valley of Ben Hinnom along the southern flank of the Jebusites, that is, Jerusalem. The boundary then ran up to the top of the hill, which flanks the valley of Hinnom on the west, at the northern end of the valley of Rephaim. And interestingly enough, Rephaim is an ancient word that probably means ghosts. There is a part of Jerusalem today that is still called Emek Rephaim, literally the valley of ghosts. If you've ever been to the Reformed congregation Kol HaNeshama, where they have beautiful singing on Friday nights, and it's a lovely Jerusalemite Reformed Jewish congregation, it is right in the middle of Emek Rephaim. The newly restored original train station in Jerusalem, the Tachana Rishona, is in Emek Rephaim. It's at the terminus of this Valley of the Ghosts, which is just a neighborhood in Jerusalem today. It's a very expensive neighborhood, really nice apartments, really nice real estate. It's beautiful. And so you have these texts in the Bible that describe this area. But again, what does that have to do with Gehenna? Well, if you look in the book of Jeremiah, he writes as follows. For the people of Judah, meaning the Jews, have done what displeases me. This, by the way, is early 6th century BCE. Declares the Eternal. They have set up their abominations in the house which is called by my name, and they have defiled it. So the people were doing bad stuff in the temple. They had put in idols or idolatrous objects, and goes on. They have built the shrines of Tophet, a foreign god, in the valley of Ben Hinnom. So they put up some kind of statues or religious shrines in this valley to burn their sons and daughters in fire, which I never commanded, which never came to my mind. And reading on, another couple chapters later in Jeremiah, thus said the Eternal, go buy a jug of potter's ware. This is the kind of thing God is always doing with prophets. He's like, here, I'm going to teach you something, but I'm going to do it by way of a physical metaphor. So go buy a jug of potter's ware and take some of the elders of the people and the priests and go out to the valley of Ben Hinnom, go out to Gehinnom, at the entrance of the Charsit gate, and proclaim there the words which I will speak to you. Hear the word of the Lord, say to them, hear the word of the Lord, O kings of Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem. Thus said the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, I am going to bring such disaster upon this place that the ears of all who hear about it will tingle. For they and their fathers and the kings of Judah have forsaken me and have made this place alien to me. They have sacrificed in it to other gods whom they have not experienced, and they have filled this place with the blood of the innocent. They have built shrines to Baal, the chief Canaanite deity, one of the chief Canaanite deities, to put their children to the fire as burnt offerings to Baal, which I never commanded, never decreed, and which never came to my mind. Assuredly, a time is coming, declares the Eternal, when this place shall no longer be called Tophet, or the valley of Ben Hinnom, but Ge HaHarega. Here it is in Hebrew. Ge HaHarega. The valley of slaughter. I will frustrate the plans of Judah and Jerusalem in this place. I will cause them to fall by the sword before their enemies, by the hand of those who seek their lives, and I will give their carcasses as food to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the earth. So, what was happening in the valley of Ben Hinnom? Anyone who wants to chime in, you don't even have to raise a hand, just unmute yourself and shout it out.
Child sacrifice.
Exactly. So the prophet Jeremiah, and this is consistent with a few other places in the Bible that make it clear that the ancient Israelites were familiar with child sacrifice and may even have been practicing it. the Bible, it's one of the most persistent themes in the Torah, which is that the firstborn male is a donated offering, is a sanctified offering to God, but you don't actually kill your children. But it's strange that it would put it that way. I mean, in other words, the Bible never says, don't sacrifice your firstborn son. It says, do sacrifice your firstborn son, just don't actually go through with it. And that, by the way, is the meaning of the binding of Isaac story. Effectively, God saying, do sacrifice your firstborn son, even though Isaac was not technically the firstborn, do sacrifice that which is most precious to you, your own only child, your beloved child, just don't actually go through with it. That's very different than having a blanket legislation that says, thou shalt not sacrifice thy children. The Hebrew Bible is very consistent. It actually says, do sacrifice your children, but don't complete the task. Make God believe that you were willing to do it, but don't actually kill your children. That seems to be, in my view, my conclusion, is that is because child sacrifice was at some point in our ancient history a normative religious practice. Now, by the time you get to Jeremiah, who's a relatively late prophet, as I said, 6th century BCE, he's saying this is an abomination before God. It's tied up with idol worship. And he pinpoints this location, the valley of Ben Hinnom, as where all of this horrible stuff was happening. So, perhaps not surprisingly, the rabbinic imagination runs wild with this and transforms Gehenna from a place on the southern slope of Jerusalem in a valley into a metaphor for eternal torment, or what we would call hell. So looking again at the text, you can see that in the earliest document of rabbinic thinking, the Mishnah, which is going to be my next subject for long-form study. I'll say more about that at the end of today's class. You have the following. I love this teaching, and I just want to apologize to my dad in advance. Rabbi Judah says in Abba Guria's name, he's his teacher, most donkey drivers are wicked, while most camel drivers are worthy men, and most sailors are pious. The best of doctors are destined for Gehenna, and the worthiest of butchers is Amalek's partner. So I say that, one, because I think it's really funny, and my dad's a doctor, and I'm sure he's not the only. What do you?
Maybe funny to you, John.
Good. Yeah, I mean, look, these are texts written by rabbis. They only have nice things to say about rabbis. So the best of doctors are destined for Gehenna. The worthiest of butchers is Amalek's partner. Okay, so they're just like, I hope this will also be a fun teaser trailer for studying Mishnah with me. And then you have probably the most well-known of Mishnahs, Pirkei Avot, right? The teachings of the fathers, or the chapters of our ancestors. Pirkei Avot, chapter 5, verse 19. Whoever possesses these three things is of the disciples of Abraham our father, and whoever possesses three other things is of the disciples of Bilam the wicked, the guy who was the soothsayer called up by the evil king Balak in order to curse the Israelites, but who was possessed by the Spirit of God, and after some obstacles with a talking donkey, ended up blessing the Israelites instead of cursing them, foiling the designs of his employer, King Balak, and instead saying of the Israelite encampment, Matovu ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael, how lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. Okay, so that's who Bilam is. The good qualities are a good eye, an ayin hatov, as opposed to the opposite, an ayin hara, which gives us the expression ke'en ahora, ke'ayin hara, which means let's avoid the evil eye. In other words, this is a superstition in Judaism, that you don't want to celebrate your good fortune too much, right? My grandmother is 98 years old, ke'en ahora, which means let me not incur the evil eye or bad luck by acknowledging this blessing, which we recognize is still tenuous. You know, what you wish a person who turns 98 years old on her birthday is have a nice day. So a good eye, a humble spirit, and a moderate appetite. These qualities belong to the disciples of Abraham our father. An evil eye, an ayin hara, a haughty spirit, and a limitless appetite, gluttony, those qualities belong to the disciples of Bilam the wicked. reading on though, what is the difference between the disciples of Abraham, our father, and the disciples of Bilam the wicked? The disciples of Abraham, our father, enjoy this world and inherit the world to come, Olam Haba, or we should say the age to come. As it is said, I will endow those who love me with substance, I will fill their treasuries, from Proverbs. But the disciples of Bilam the wicked inherit Gehinnom and descend into the nethermost pit. As it is said, for you, O God, will bring them down to the nethermost pit, those murderous and treacherous men. They shall not live out half their days, but I, meanwhile, I, the psalmist, trust in you. So again, the way in which the rabbis take Gehinnom, it's no longer a valley on the southern slope of Jerusalem. It is rather a stand-in for eternal damnation or hell. And it does make its way into the Jewish text. It never becomes what it does in Christian scriptures, which I've provided here from the Gospel of Mark, which was the first gospel to be written, though if you pick up a copy of the New Testament, it's always the second. It's always Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But Mark predates Matthew by at least 8 to 10 years in terms of when it was composed. Probably composed around the year 70, 72, 74 of the Common Era. From the Revised Standard Version translation, Jesus is teaching here. And if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed than with 2 hands to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than with 2 feet to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into hell, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched, for everyone will be salted with fire. And I went and looked into this passage because I was looking up where you first find hell in Christian scriptures, and this is it. And I noted that in this passage, the word translated as hell is the Koine Greek, which is the dialect in which the New Testament Gospels are written. And the word is here in Greek, which is pronounced, you notice, Gehenna, right here, from the International Pronunciation Directory. So the New Testament takes up the word Gehenna and gives us the much more conventional 21st century understanding of what we mean when we talk about Gehenna or hell, a place of eternal fire, of punishment and torment for the sinful. I'm looking in my chat window because I have a couple of comments that came up. Balaam had only 1 eye. Yes. One of the weird things, this seer, this ancient seer or soothsayer, is identified as Stum Ha'ayin, which means maybe he was a cyclops. And Alan writes, where does Sheol fit in? And the answer is we don't know, because Sheol, we recall, was not a place of damnation. It was just like Hades. It was just the underworld. Nothing happens in Sheol. We talked about that a lot at the beginning of our study several months ago. I'm not going to get into the story of the golem, but we have all sorts of other fun Jewish folklore about the dead coming to life. The most famous is the story of the golem, and the most famous iteration of this ancient folktale is the one told by Rabbi Judah Lev of Prague, or the Maharal, who lived between 1525 and 1609. And it's the story of how this famous rabbi created a living entity, like a golem, an inanimate clay object that is brought to life by inscribing on his chest the word emet, which means truth, and then who is killed by erasing or striking out, crossing out the aleph of emet, which turns the word from emet to mate, which means dead. Instead, what I'd like to do, you've probably heard of the golem tales before, but I want to focus on one last kind of fun piece, and then this is the first of the 3 codas to our class. So we're going to get to watch a little bit of video. We're going to watch the first 7 or 8 minutes of the Coen brothers movie, A Serious Man, which, by the way, takes place all in Yiddish. It's a very strange prologue, but it is a modern, or it is a take on the old Jewish folktale of the Dybbuk. And the Dybbuk comes from the Hebrew word dabak or davek, In modern Hebrew, by the way, the word devek means tape or glue, and it means to cling to or to stick to. But a Dybbuk is the spirit of a dead person who takes up residency in an unsuspecting living person, and it's basically the Jewish version of demonic possession. So all of these fun things, again, the theme of this last part of our study is just kind of odds and ends from Jewish occult. So let's take a look at a little bit of a serious man. Oh, great. Is it not going to let me do this? One moment, please. I have to stop the screen share, go to my movie, hit play. It may not be possible to show it over Zoom. I will be so disappointed. Yeah, not letting me because it's in high def. Oh, I'm so disappointed. So go ahead and rent. This movie can be played only on displays that support high bandwidth digital content protection. Well, screw you. Okay. Give me a second here. I did call up another thing that we can watch instead. So some final thoughts. I'm opening a link here. Let me see that I got this right. Okay. Okay. This is the final scene of one of my favorite movies of all time. So we had to get rid of the Dybbuk, but I was reminded by my dad that we really need to end class on the following note. So here we go. YouTube doesn't have its digital content protected. So we're going to just watch a little bit of the end of Woody Allen's wonderful 1974 movie, Love and Death, because in it he comments on, he kind of tries to summarize everything we've studied about the meaning of death and what happens after we die. And if this isn't Jewish wisdom, I don't know what is. Here we go.
Complicated situation, Cousin Sonia.
Okay.
I'm
just skipping a little bit.
In a different Westchester. Likes physically with the firm
is to suffer, not to love.
Here we go.
Suffers from not loving. Therefore, to love is to suffer, not to love is to suffer. To suffer is to suffer. To be happy is to love. To be happy, then, is to suffer, but suffering makes one unhappy. Therefore, to be unhappy, one must love or love to suffer or suffer from too much happiness. I hope you're getting this down.
I never want to marry. I just want to get divorced.
Oh, look! Look! It's Boris! Boris! Boris, what happened?
I got screwed.
How?
I don't know. Some vision came and said that I was going to get pardoned, and they shot me.
You were my one great love.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm dead.
What's it like?
What's it like? You know the chicken at Tresky's restaurant?
Yeah.
It's worse.
Worse than the chicken at Tresky's. Oh well, life must go on. The last traces of the shimmering dusk are setting behind the quickly darkening evening. And it's only noon. Soon we shall be covered by wheat.
Did you say wheat? Wheat.
Wheat. I'm dead. They're talking about wheat. The question is, have I learned anything about life? Only that human beings are divided into mind and body. The mind embraces all the nobler aspirations like poetry and philosophy, but the body has all the fun. The important thing, I think, is not to be bitter. You know, if it turns out that there is a God, I don't think that he's evil. I think that the worst you can say about him is that basically he's an underachiever. After all, you know, there are worse things in life than death. I mean, if you've ever spent an evening with an insurance salesman, you know exactly what I mean. The key here, I think, is to not think of death as an end, But think of it more as a very effective way of cutting down on your expenses. Regarding love, what can you say? It's not the quantity of your sexual relations that count, it's the quality. On the other hand, if quantity drops below 178 months, I would definitely look at
Zooming like crazy.
Well, that's about it for me, folks.
Just at the end of a class here, but I have to know my stuff. I promise you, I'll call you back as soon as it's done about this. You've been like 5 minutes. All right.
Okay. Oh, somebody's
No,
on.
I want to talk to you. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay. Yes. Trying to mute everyone. So a little bit from one of my favorite movies of all time, Woody Allen's Love and Death. Though it seems to me that I wanted to end this note on a kind of a thoughtful note as well, a little bit of humor, but also a little food for thought. And so what I'd like to do is turn to one last reading for us and share with you, I think, one of the most beautiful ways that any teacher has ever articulated the meaning of our lives and our deaths, and an authentically Jewish view of our immortality. And the words, of course, were written by Rabbi Jack Stern of blessed memory, who led our congregation for 29 years as our senior rabbi between 1962 and 1991, and whose 9th yahrzeit was observed just last month. So I'm going to do one last screen share, and give me just a second to get this right. As you know, I've been trying to get the technology going throughout this course, and I have had modest success. So one moment. Okay, good. And I'll just read this for us since that's probably the easiest way to go. Okay, share the screen. Here we are. So this is a sermon for Yizkor, for the service of remembrance of the dead, that is offered 4 times a year on the Jewish calendar. We have a Yizkor service on the afternoon of Yom Kippur and on the mornings of the pilgrimage festivals. The morning of Simchat Torah Shmini Atzeret, on the morning of Pesach, that's the last day of Pesach, and on the morning of Shavuot. And this is a Yizkor talk called Memory and Melody that was delivered in 1979. So I'll share it with you. The day is almost over, the day on which a Jew stands before his God with the totality of his being. Not mind alone, not feelings alone, but the person that he is. Oh no, what did I do here? Sorry. Then, almost at day's end, this service of Yizkor to remind us of what we already know, that who we are and what we are bound up in some mysterious and wonderful way with the very ones whom we now remember. For me, this service of Yizkor began on a Sunday afternoon this summer at the Tanglewood Music Festival with a performance of Mahler's Ninth Symphony conducted by Leonard Bernstein. It was the last symphony that Mahler completed before his death in 1910. One of his biographers suggests that the symphony may have been a requiem for his own daughter, who had died not long before, and for his own brothers and sisters who had been long since dead. It may thus have been for Mahler a very personal Yizkor. But for anyone who has ever listened to it, it can become for that person an encounter with living and dying and loving and remembering. At least it did for me. From its melodies and its rhythms there came joy and weeping. There was childhood and there was nature. There was dazzling springtime and leaves trying on colors, and there was bleak winter. There were moments of exaltation and moments of groping to break out of emptiness. There was longing for life and the insistence of death. There was, finally, the lingering farewell of the cello and fragments of a melody, and then total silence and peace. The critic's review that appeared in our local Berkshire newspaper stated that the challenge of Mahler's Ninth lies in making the pieces fit together, and that Bernstein rose to that challenge. And then the writer added, Bernstein picked out every detail, every inner voice and line, and gave each its due importance. And thus on a Sunday afternoon this summer did I think of today, and did this service of Yizkor begin. Everyone who has loved and lost becomes a trustee of those lines once written, once lived, once shared, and later remembered. There are some of us who live constantly with their memories, but for others of us, suddenly a shared moment flashes into our consciousness as though from nowhere, but we know it was there all the time in our own safekeeping. We ourselves say something or see something in our children, and we ourselves are surprised at how well the lines have been remembered. And thus this service of Yizkor when we become the conductors. We put the pieces of memory together, we listen to what they wrote in the lines and what they wrote between the lines, each line its own statement of the person they were or else would have been had there only been more time. We listen to the saying of yes to life, to the surrendering, to the no of death, to the why of grief, to the silence. We put the lines together and we take them with us for our own journey of the Spirit on Yom Kippur. And those memories, fitted together, become a source of strength and of beauty and of understanding as we proceed on our own journey before the closing of the gates. From where we sat at Tanglewood, we could watch Leonard Bernstein's face and there were tears on his cheeks. He was saying Kaddish without words. He was delivering a eulogy without a name. For the dead of our people who lie in unmarked graves, we have no names, and for them we say Kaddish. But for our own beloved, we do have the names. In fact, said the rabbis in the Midrash, there are 3 names that belong to each person, the name given to him at birth, the name by which others call him, and the name he creates for himself. It is that 3rd name that we take with us on this journey of the Spirit, its life and love still with us. Even when the cello has played its part, even with the total silence, there is still the memory and the melody that make the world sing. And to that we can all say Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much for joining our study. Let me tell you what is forthcoming on our calendar. Next Thursday, I'm going to take a week off to begin my preparation for my next course of Zoom study. On Thursday the 28th, 2 weeks from today, rather than teach in the morning, you are all invited for a global festival of Jewish learning hosted by Westchester Reformed Temple, a Tikkun Leil Shavuot from America to Israel, starting at 5 p.m. It's in your weekly e-blast. That e-blast comes out, the electronic newsletter, on Thursdays. I'll have Natalie send the link around as well. You can log on anytime between 5 p.m. and the last session starts at 7 a.m. on Friday. And all throughout the late afternoon, evening, well into the night, into the wee hours, every hour on the hour, a rabbi will take up a new topic of study. They are all fascinating. The detailed list of all of the topics is actually on the Temple's Facebook page, but I'll send that around as well. It's really going to be exciting. I'm taking the graveyard shift at midnight. I promise not to call up the Witch of Endor or the ghost of the prophet Samuel, but we are going to look at a passage from the Babylonian Talmud from Tractate Baba Kama, exploring life during a time of plague. So a lot of my colleagues and I have chosen topics that are particularly relevant to this year and the strange and difficult circumstances in which we are going to be gathering. That's next Thursday night. The following Thursday, the WRT Women of Reform Judaism are hosting their annual spring meeting. So the WRJ leadership and participants and members will have a little bit of business to conduct. And then Carol might be able to tell you this, but I'm delivering remarks at noon on the subject of new ways to understand God through mysticism and neo-Hasidism. So that's going to be a really fun text study. We touched on some of that 2 weeks ago when we looked at the mystics. And we're going to look at how mystical thought makes its way into Hasidism and shapes a new understanding of God. So that's Thursday the 4th. I think I'm speaking. Yep.
Your program will start about 12:30.
Perfect. So tune in. The Zoom link will be made available to our congregants, again, through the newsletter, or you can ask Natalie. And then starting on June 11th, I'll do an introduction to Mishnah at this time, 10:15 in the morning. All of this will be communicated out. We haven't lined up the Zoom links for that yet, but it'll probably be the same one that you're using for this class, which is a dedicated online classroom. Then I'm on vacation on the 18th, 25th, and July 2nd. So we're going to resume July 9th. But there's learning, with the exception of next week, there's Thursday learning coming up for the next several weeks, although at slightly different times in different formats. And if you don't remember what I said, just tune into the website, tune into the weekly newsletter. I just want to say from the heart how grateful I am to have this robust, avid online community of learners. I do miss seeing you in person, but I feel so moved and gratified to know that you continue to connect to your temple and to one another and to me and my clergy colleagues at the synagogue. It takes on new meaning for me to say I'm here. I am here. I'm here in my living room where I live now. But I'm here for each of you, as are my colleagues. If you or someone in your family is in need of a little bit of extra connection, or you're concerned about a loved one and how he or she might be faring during these difficult days, whether it is because of isolation or health concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out. We can't come into the building of WRT in large gatherings, but WRT is very much here for you. Thank you so much. Shalom, everyone.
Shalom. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.